Me getting to a part 2 immediately? Truly, the stars have aligned. Hi, I'm Konor the Harlequin, and welcome back to Live from the Black Library, where today I'm going to be talking to you about part 2 of the adoptive parents of the Primarchs. Now, while it's not really mandatory to have seen part 1, which was released last week, I would highly recommend it, because there often will be some context bleed and some references made, and I think it's probably just a good video if you like this one as well. Here today, though, I'm going to be talking about those individuals who, when the Primarchs landed on their home worlds after being scattered by the forces of chaos away from the Emperor's gene laboratory, would take them in as their own and raise them for a time, until the Great Crusade came knocking and they would rejoin their true father, the Emperor. However, rather than just being some kind of parentage stopgap, it is often the case that the lessons and examples that these adoptive parents imparted onto their children would have far-reaching effects for their adoptive children and the galaxy as a whole. Also, I would like to note, while this video is part 2, there is a part 3 after it, because I couldn't get to everything in time, and my schedule is pretty busy, given that I'm going to be doing some traveling. So, breaking this video up into 2 both helps free up my schedule and give me some things to upload when I'm not going to be working as effectively since I'll be on the road. And for any inconvenience that might be causing, I'm really sorry. To briefly recap before we get into it from last video, Number 1 was Luther, the adoptive father of Lionel Johnson from Caliban, who would raise him, but be surpassed by him in their order that fought against the warp beasts of the world, and who he would eventually betray when he turned to chaos, due to his feeling put out and left behind. Next was Tuella and Corin, who raised Fulgrim, and only briefly were in his lives before they died early given the harsh conditions on the planet of Chemos. So, they don't register too much in his mind, but gave him an understanding of what flaws can do to somebody, even though he knows the flaws weren't their fault. Next was Damokos, the adoptive father of Perturabo, who he had a very strained relationship with. Damokos tried to reach out to Perturabo, but Perturabo seems to have rebuffed him every single time. Then was Ong Khan, the Khan who raised Jagatai Khan, and who he would be avenged by when he was killed in a raid by a rival tribe, a tribe that Jagatai would wipe out in retribution. And this would spawn Jagatai's commitment to loyalty and honor. Next was the She-Wolf and Thengir, who raised Leman Russ. When Leman Russ crash-landed on the planet of Fenris, he would be raised by a she-wolf and her cubs, but eventually, that she-wolf and all but 2 cubs who were basically his siblings would be wiped out by the king of the Russ named Thengir, who would take on Leman. That's why Leman Russ is both very barbarous and animalistic, but also very refined and intelligent. He got the best of both worlds. Then there was Dorn's grandfather, who actually never told Dorn that he was adopted until later, and raised him from a child. Dorn actually values him very deeply, and continues to sleep with the old man's cloak over 200 years after he died. Then there was Conrad Kurz, who was raised by nobody, likely owing to him being very violent and not having an understanding of the value of human life. Then there was the Pure of the Blood, the entire tribe, small tribe mind you, that raised Sanguinius on Baal Secundus. They would basically instill in him his desire to want to protect innocent people and let people live their lives free of fear and suffering. Also, their compassion for him, despite technically being a mutant given his wings, instilled compassion in him. And they would also come to view him as a god. Then there was Ferrus Manus, who was also raised by no one, and who would instead basically raise himself in the mountains of Medusa, observing the various clans of the world from afar, eventually revealing himself to them after having become essentially like a cryptid/urban legend to these people, as some force that was out there killing monsters. And now we're all up to speed. But before we get into it, I just want to say thank you so much for watching this video. Please subscribe if you have not already done so, consider supporting me on Patreon if you can, and joining my Discord server linked down below. So without any further ado, let's get into part 2 of the adopted parents of the Primarchs. And we will be starting with, since there is no number 11, number 12, Oenomaus, who took in the Primarch Angron on the planet of Nuceria. Now, Oenomaus is interesting because he too was a slave. Specifically, one of those slaves that would be held by the elites of the planet called High Riders and forced to fight to the death over and over again for the masses, in order to stop them from rebelling. You know, bread and circuses and all that. Oenomaus, however, was one of the older slaves, and as such, took on a very fatherly role to many of the younger ones, giving them advice, giving them guidance, telling them how things work, but also giving them hope. Because Oenomaus was planning a rebellion. For a long time, he had been laying the groundwork and getting everyone ready to rebel against their masters and break free, kill the guards, run out of the Colosseum, and escape into the hills. Yes, many of them would die, but it would be a worthy death if ever there was one. There was hope, but it was kind of a pipe dream to a lot of people, until Angron, freshly emerged from his capsule, would be deposited in the cave prison where the slaves were kept. And they thought, damn, maybe we might have a chance with someone like Angron on our side. But this would be short-lived, because Oenomaus and Angron would be pitted against two berserk Ogrins equipped with the Butcher's Nails in the arena. And while they would emerge victorious, the High Riders would demand that the two fight each other to the death, which they would flatly refuse to do. However, Angron would take it a step further, basically saying, if the High Riders want blood, why don't they come and fight us themselves? And at first Oenomaus tries to tell him, hey, calm down, let's not push it here, but he sees Angron is really just committed and has that fire in him, and he starts beaming with pride and starts joining him in taunting the High Riders. These two had a really special relationship. They fought together, they bled together, they watched friends die together. And when Angron shows that he has special abilities to Oenomaus by taking away the pain and anxiety that a young boy was experiencing in the fit of a nightmare, Oenomaus says to him, "You aren't meant for this place," says Oenomaus. "Wherever you came from, whatever it is that you are destined for, you will not find it within these walls. And one day, these caves and these chains will not be able to hold us, and you will be free to find your destiny." "My destiny is beside you, Oenomaus," says Angron, "with my brothers and sisters, living free of the hot dust." The grizzled fighter smiles. "Then free of the hot dust we shall be." It's really touching, and you can see the effect he has on Angron, growing into a man with a deep sense of honor and caring for those around him, who values martial prowess but understands the spirit of a warrior and the desire to be free rather than just a blind animal. But it was not to be, because Angron's outburst against the High Riders would have them implant in him the Butcher's Nails, technology implanted directly into his brain and coming out his scalp, which would drive him into a blood-hungry fervor. And when those nails were first implanted, the High Riders would get their wish of having Angron set against his adoptive father who he loved. And the blood, he is covered in it. Its metallic stink fills his nose, and it is still warm as it drips from his chin. His skull throbs from the Butcher's Nails. His skin is fever hot as his body tries to heal over them, as if they were any other wound, but it can't. That is when he hears it. He hears the guards speaking together, laughing as they count their winnings after Oenomaus was butchered in the pit. He hears them say the name of the one who killed the only father he had ever known and desecrated his remains. That it was he, Angron, who had slain Oenomaus. The air is driven from his lungs. An invisible fist has entered his chest, crushing his heart in its grip. Angron sags forward, as far as his chains allow before they snap taut. Oenomaus, the wisest of them, the best of them, the one who had spent decades readying the slaves for the uprising, the only one who could rally the gladiators to stand as one and throw off the High Riders' oppression. Gone, by his hand. The howl that rips from Angron's lips shakes the walls. It is so loud that it rouses the entire arena guard to scramble, fearing a slave rebellion. He screams, even after his throat tears and blood bursts from his lips. It continues on for 3 days, a scream of such sadness and pain, nothing like it has ever been heard before or since. This right here is the tipping point, where Angron takes up the helm and leads the slaves in their doomed rebellion. However, that too was not to be, as the Emperor would snatch him away from the other slaves and leave them to their fate, something Angron never ever got over or forgave the Emperor for. So, it's interesting to note how, while many people cite Angron's kidnapping by the Emperor at the pivotal moment as the reason he broke, it should be noted that things like the death of Oenomaus absolutely contributed to that. Angron was growing into a fine man, but so many factors, one of them being the death of Oenomaus, made certain that he would never be anything more than a walking tragedy. One interesting thing to note, though, is that Oenomaus was actually a real person. He was one of the gladiators alongside Spartacus who led the Third Servile War. You know, the one where the slaves escaped from Rome and launched a large-scale rebellion across the Italian peninsula, and actually almost won before they were crushed. And much like his fictional counterpart, the real Oenomaus was instrumental in organizing the escape and rebellion, but would ultimately be killed pretty early on. Next on the list is quite likely the most famous one, and that is Konor Guilliman and Tarasha Euten, the adoptive parents of Roboute Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines. Now, Roboute Guilliman basically lucked out the hardest by far out of any of his brothers with regard to what planet he landed on and who took him in, because Macragge was a highly civilized, advanced world which was doing just great for itself all over and had a stable system of government, being ruled by 2 consuls. However, when you say consul, that immediately conjures images of the Roman Republic, where consuls were rotated out every year. However, here, consuls seem to have been basically a lifetime position, if not a hereditary one. So, Konor Guilliman was one of these consuls, alongside another named Gallen, and the reason for having 2 consuls is so that they can keep each other in check. But when Guilliman crash-landed on the planet, he would be discovered by some noblemen out hunting, who would take him to Konor, who would then adopt him and give him the name Roboute Guilliman. And this would go absolutely great, because Roboute Guilliman was able to get the best education Macragge and very likely the entire galaxy had at the time, and he also got a front row seat to watching his father be a political operator. And his father was a great politician. He was compassionate, he was egalitarian, he championed the position and concerns of the people as opposed to the noble elite. This is where Guilliman gets his values of leadership and his way of doing things, making sure everything is managed, not just rushing in, carrying a carrot and a big stick, because he will put down rebellions, but also is willing to accept surrender and contrition. This is because he observed his father granting clemency to those regions of Macragge that were rebellious and not fully under their control, such as the region known as Illyria. However, the Illyrians would launch a large-scale rebellion that would draw Roboute away from the capital, and it would be there that Konor Guilliman would be assassinated by his fellow consul, as we see here from the short story Sinew of War, from Scions of the Emperor, the anthology book. I noticed an odd aroma in the air, bitter and chemical. It seemed worryingly familiar, and I scoured my memory, trying to recall where I had smelt it before. Then I saw movement on the floor near Gallen, near the burning tapestry. "Watch out," I snapped. He backed away and we both raised our guns. I gasped as I saw a man crumbled on the floor like a piece of broken furniture. "Father," I howled, shaking my head. "No!" We rushed towards him, but he held up a warning hand and we stopped a few feet away, both whispering curses. His ornamental cuirass was punched full of holes and his robes were drenched in blood. His leg was bent underneath him at a sickening angle, and his skin was scorched and blistered. Worst of all, though, was the dark line at his throat. It looked like a second mouth, wide and leering, dribbling crimson threads. He gasped, trying to breathe, color draining from his face. I dropped to my knees, reaching out to him. Again, he waved me away, desperate warning in his eyes. He tried to speak, but only managed hideous bubbling. For all my strange gifts, I could do nothing as he slipped away, choking on his own blood, gripping his throat and trying to sit up. I tore some of my cloak to wrap it around his neck, but he pointed a pistol at my face, fury in his eyes. "Who did this?" I gasped, but he did not seem to register my words. When I stopped trying to touch him, the anger left his eyes, and he tried to reach for something on the floor. I grabbed it. It was a coin. It must have fallen from his robes when he fell. I tried to give it to him, but he shook his head, indicating that I should close my fist around it. I gasped as I understood what he was doing. He was reminding me of that day in the mountains, the day when he handed me a coin and promised I would never be alone. "No," I howled, but he was still pointing a gun at me, refusing to let me approach. Gallen put a hand on my shoulder, but I shrugged him off, gripping the coin so hard it buckled. For nearly a minute, my father lay there, gun pointed at my head, warning me not to touch him. Then his stare hardened, focusing on somewhere only the dead could see. That day in the mountains that he's reminding him of is from another passage earlier in the same story. I was 5 and my father had taken me hunting. I knew why. Even then, I could read people as easily as I read the military treatises in Ducalis' library. My father had seen me watching his generals and magistrates. He saw how I despised them. The great statesmen of the greatest city were idiots, blind to the most important resource on the planet, their own needlessly oppressed people. They were fools and tyrants, and even aged 5, I wanted to tear down the whole hidebound edifice. My father felt the same. I knew he did, but my place in Macragge was precarious, and he was too wise to risk my life on a point of principle. So he took me away, a place we both loved, to the cold, beautiful foothills of the Crown Mountains, where we could breathe clean air and ease our fury by scrambling over rocks and scree. Away from the Senate, my father dropped the pretense that I was a normal child, and we hunted together as equals. He laughed, as he always did, at the sight of my unfettered strength, proud of his strange little son. But then, I saw him fall, grimacing at a gash on his arm. A dreadful truth hit me. We were not equals. We never could be. My father was not like me. The man who taught me about life was not destined to live. The flash of crimson on his tunic stalled my breath. One day, Konor Guilliman would die. He would leave me behind. Leave me with the fools and the tyrants. In that moment, I became the child I usually only pretended to be. Tears filled my eyes, and I placed my hand over his wound, wishing it away. He laughed, shaking his head, not in mockery, but reassurance. He took out a coin and handed it to me. His face was minted on one side, and Consul Gallen's was minted on the other. He closed my hand over it, squeezing it tight. "Feel its strength," he said. Strong as I was, I could not crush the metal. "The coin is Macragge," he said, "beautiful and unbreakable, made to outlive us all. And while there is a Macragge, I will be with you, Roboute. My virtue is the virtue of Macragge. My strength is the strength of Macragge. This is not just my home, Roboute. It is my soul, and it is my family. And it is your family too. Macragge will endure. Macragge must endure. And as long as it does, you will not be alone." He sounds like Mufasa here, Jesus! But you can see the immense amount of love and affection between these two, and it really shows you just how far this went in shaping who Guilliman would become. However, Konor Guilliman was not his only parent, because there was also his adoptive mother, Tarasha Euten. And this is one of those things I got wrong initially, where I said that she was Konor Guilliman's wife and therefore Queen of Macragge because I had incorrectly stated Konor was the King of Macragge. You see, Tarasha Euten was actually Konor Guilliman's seneschal, meaning she was basically his day-to-day. You know, his sort of assistant and organizer and so on. So while Konor Guilliman was more of a warm fatherly figure, Tarasha Euten was kind of more of the sort of disciplinarian. You know, she was sassy, she was witty, she was smart, and she was not unwilling to criticize Guilliman when the need arose. And considering the fact that she lived through the horusheresy, she was there for Guilliman, especially during the Great Crusade, and during that period when he established Imperium Secundus on Macragge, when he needed someone to talk to, because she was able to keep him humble, keep him in check, and tell him what was what in a way that none of his sons would be able to do. In fact, even though he was this giant armored demigod, she would still refer to him as boy. One example of this comes from the book Unremembered Empire, where she talks to Guilliman about Lionel Johnson's arrival on Macragge where everyone is celebrating. "So my people think he will save them when I cannot?" Guilliman had asked as he strapped on his ceremonial late in the residency's fitting chamber. Euten had blown a raspberry. "They celebrate the moment, you foolish boy," she replied. "They welcome his arrival. He is noble and he is loyal." Guilliman had nodded. "Are you jealous of him?" Euten had asked. "No." "You are. You are. Because he is the Lord of the Firstborn. I never thought I would see such jealousy in you, my dear lord. It does not become you, but it is also rather sweet." Guilliman had growled something indecipherable and then demanded that his armorers adjust the servo-fit of his pauldrons. "Of course," Euten had added thoughtfully, "he is the Lord of the First, and thus the first of your equals. But he was not the first found." "What, woman?" "Horus was the first lost son to be found. Look how well that ended, my lord." Guilliman had looked at her and laughed. He couldn't stop himself. It had felt good. "First is not always best," Euten had said, also laughing. "My 8th found son of the 13th Legion. Look who has an empire." Now, what's interesting to note is that she calls him boy and not son, and he calls her woman, not mother, because technically she never was his adoptive parent, just a mother figure. It's kind of more like how Alfred Pennyworth is the father figure to Bruce Wayne, but not actually his father, and they use these other terms because that's just what's supposed to be said. She calls him my lord in the same way Alfred calls him Master Wayne. And despite that terminology, their relationship is very informal and very warm. We can see this by the fact that they're laughing together and joking about Guilliman's brothers. You have to remember that even though he was functionally a full-grown adult when Konor Guilliman died, he was still only 12 years old. So, Euten has been there for a very long time, so they're very, very close. And he's prone to reminiscing and longing for her input in the same way he did for his father Konor. From the book Ruinstorm, he looked back with horror on the Imperium Secundus, at its arrogance. The Lion and Sanguinius had been right to mistrust it, yet he had insisted upon its necessity and dragged them into his delusion. He wondered how many of his brothers had been brought to make war on the Emperor in exactly the same way. The conclusion of the theoretical was appalling. Corrupted, walking the assigned path, he had become a corrupter in his turn. He wished Tarasha Euten was there. He wanted her counsel now, more than any others. He needed to hear her dismiss the premise of his corruption. Is that what you call making a mistake now? He could hear her voice in his head. He could see her wry expression as she spoke those words. Only she was on Macragge, not the Samath race. She had not spoken. The words belonged to his wishful mental constructions. They served no purpose. They were an attempt at self-absolution. They were meaningless. You see, it's not just that he wants her advice, he also wants some emotional comfort from her, because she really was like a mother to him. Now, her fate, unlike Konor Guilliman, is unknown, because she would be aboard the Macragg's Honor when it was ambushed by traitor forces, the second attempt on her life after Conrad Kurz tried to kill her, in which she told him to his face to go to hell. So as her section of the ship began to burn, she would be trapped there with an ultramarine sergeant named Amon, who would hunker down with her, waiting for help to arrive. It was clear that the assassination attempt was against her because she believed that the rebels believed they could use her to hurt Guilliman, but she laughs, stating that that phase of life has passed, because she's now very, very old and was, in her words, unable to survive the next warp jump, with her heart being on the way out already. She was very nearly at the end of her life, but was also likely exaggerating to put Amon at ease. And as the smoke began to fill the room, she would actually recount an old story of when Guilliman conquered the Illyrian wildmen tribes back on Macragge, and how masterfully he did it. And she also discussed how, initially, she had fears about Guilliman. He seemed too cold, too machine-like, unlike the other children, and she was worried what he might become because it was clear how powerful and different he was. But she commented on how her and Konor had raised him into a fine man, and how she is satisfied with her life's work, so Amon need not save her. She's done what she set out to do in life. Ultimately, her fate is unknown, because the last we see of her is when she's coughing, because the smoke is now too much, and Amon is trying to get her to drink water and relax, after again she wasted her breath telling a very long story. With the last we know of her being her and Amon in that smoke-filled room together, with their door slowly being cut open by someone on the other side, with Amon asking if it's one of the brother Ultramarines or not, because they don't know, leaving her fate up in the air. But even if she did survive this, she probably wouldn't have lived much long after the heresy, and by the time Guilliman would enter his stasis coma, she was almost certainly dead from old age, if not here. Next on the list is Necare, the adoptive father of Mortarion, Primarch of the Death Guard, and he is one of the absolute worst. You see, Mortarion would land on the toxic world of Barbarous, where the normal humans lived in the low valleys, while the Overseers, a race of warp-tainted alien sorcerers, and yes, they are confirmed to be alien in origin, occupied the hill and mountain peaks that were covered in toxic haze, meaning no uprising against them was ever possible. So they would send down their monstrosities, and come down themselves, to terrorize the population into servitude and slavery. Mortarion, despite being human, would be recognized as a unique and powerful being by the greatest of these overlords, Necare, who would take him in and adopt him as a son. But make no mistake, there was no love present there, because Necare was molding Mortarion into a tool and a weapon. Basically what Perturabo believed Damocos was doing to him. However, despite all the brutality and abuse, Mortarion knew that something was wrong, that he wasn't like Necare. So he sought out the people in the valleys below, despite his father telling him that if he ever came back, he would be killed. He would then see their plight, side with them, and lead a rebellion, where they would cleanse almost the entire world of the overlords, with the last one standing being Necare, given that his mansion was up on the highest peak and therefore the most toxic. However, Mortarion would endeavor to face him alone when a stranger came by and challenged him that he couldn't do it, and if Mortarion couldn't do it, he would have to serve the stranger, who was actually the Emperor in disguise. Mortarion tried but very nearly died right at his father's door, only for the Emperor to step in, save him, and kill Necare himself. Something that Mortarion never ever forgave the Emperor for. In fact, before he lost consciousness on that mountain, he said to himself, "I will always hate you," because he was that bitter at having his vengeance snatched away from him. Now you must be then thinking to yourself, wow, Necare must have messed him up a lot. And you're kind of right, but maybe not to the degree you think. You might think, oh, Mortarion was bitter and had a chip on his shoulder forever because of everything Necare put him through. But not really. If anything, it gave him two big legacies. One being his sense of justice. You see, a lot of people tend to forget that Mortarion was very, very quick to wipe out anyone he viewed as oppressing the weak. And this wasn't something unique to him. Again, Corvus Corax was much the same way. However, while Corax was a liberator, Mortarion was a punisher. And it gave him an everlasting, eternal hatred of Psychers, a hatred that would translate into him petitioning the Emperor to have the Librarius banned across all Space Marine legions at the Council of Nicaea, which, as we know, had very overreaching consequences. However, the core of Mortarion's bitterness, what drove him to betray the Imperium and side with Horus, came from the Emperor, not Necare, because he again felt robbed of his vengeance against his adoptive father. So, he would hold this against the Emperor and forge a closer relationship with Horus Lupercal, one that would make it very easy for him to betray the Imperium. This, however, was not the end of Necare's story, because so bitter was Mortarion that after he became a demon prince of Nurgle, he would actually delve into the warp and find Necare's soul, trapping it in a giant grandfather clock that would continually release new poisons and toxins to torture him forever. And he would actually keep it in his chambers and occasionally talk to it. That's from the Plague Wars books, and Mortarion mentally comments on how it actually gives him little comfort, but at least it's not nothing. Next on the list is Amon, adoptive father of Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Sons. And this is another very interesting one, because here we see another example of a Primarch's adoptive parent becoming a pseudo-marine. Now, a pseudo-marine, for those who don't know, are those individuals who are far too old to become full Space Marines by the time the Great Crusade found them, but given the fact that they were connected to someone, usually a Primarch, they were able to undergo rejuvenat treatments, gene enhancement, and a few surgeries and implants to allow them to become functionally immortal and at least stronger than the average person. Not equivalent to a Space Marine, but still clearly more than human. Examples of this are Luther, adoptive father of Lionel Johnson, Amon, the adoptive father of Magnus the Red, and Corferon, the adoptive father of Lorgar, but we'll get to him later. What I do find interesting though is the comparison between Amon and Luther, but I'm gonna circle back to that. You see, when the psychically powerful baby Magnus crash-landed on Prospero with one great city on it, Tisca, he would be taken in by Amon. But Amon wasn't really a unique figure. Sure, he was a member of the leading citizenry of Tisca, and yes, he did mentor and tutor him in the ways of being a good Tiscan and a good scholar. Prosperine society was highly developed, and there were many people like Amon running around at the time. So, he wasn't really a singular figure in the ways Luther and Konor Guilliman were. However, he was absolutely instrumental to Magnus, because even after Magnus surpassed him very quickly in terms of psychic ability, he would still remain a trusted advisor and guide to him. Someone to help him grow and mature, even if he wasn't really a teacher anymore, because he had nothing left to teach Magnus. Interestingly, Magnus would actually be the one who helped him expand his abilities, because many members of Magnus's entourage of psychics would actually have their abilities expanded and unlocked in new ways because of him. Amon, for example, unlocked Prescience, and would become the first Magister Templii, or leader, of the Prescience school, known later as the Corvidae. However, he would eventually cede that position to Azek Araman, a Terran Space Marine who he had a pretty significant rivalry with, and the reason for that is not known. What is known, though, is the fact that through all of this, he never left Magnus's side, remaining a valuable aide and later a valuable son, as he would become one of those pseudo-Space Marines like Luther. And this is where I'm gonna go ahead and circle back to the comparison between Amon and Luther, because they started in the same place. They were leading men of their societies, who adopted infant Primarchs because they saw their immense potential, and would raise them for a short time before being wholeheartedly surpassed by said Primarch because they're a Primarch, and end up becoming one of their sons, but not a full one, a pseudo-Astartes, all of which resulted in them losing that position as a fatherly figure to the Primarch. But while Luther let that drive him up the wall to catastrophic consequences, Amon absolutely took it in stride, being an absolutely loyal son, to the point where it literally landed him in a body cast, and he had to put aside his personal enmity with Ahriman in order to save Magnus's deteriorating soul after Russ had broken it. However, Amon would eventually drift further away from Magnus, but not because of any of his own failings or weaknesses, but because Magnus was the one kind of going off the rails. You see, after the Council of Nicaea and after Magnus found out Horus was being corrupted by chaos, Amon would be one of the few Marines who would wholeheartedly try to help him fix things and save the Imperium. But when all of that backfired and the Thousand Sons were going to be wiped out by the Space Wolves, Magnus wanted to just sit and let the Legion die as penance. But Amon said no, we have to fight for our home. And he expected his quote oldest friend to help him in that. And even though Magnus would step in eventually, the rift couldn't be healed between them. And it would all come to a head when Amon would help Azek Ahriman, now in the Eye of Terror on the planet of sorcerers, conduct the rubric ritual to save the Legion from the flesh change, which resulted in a huge chunk of the Legion being turned into mindless, soulless living husks called rubric marines. For this, he would be cast out of the Legion along with the other members involved, and eventually break with Ahriman as well and form his own group called the Brotherhood of Dust. And their plan was to actually undo the rubric as a means to basically drive the Legion to extinction in order to save them from the cycle of suffering that they had become locked into. As you can imagine, Ahriman was against this and managed to kill Amon and take control of the Brotherhood of Dust, folding them into his own warband. Also, when he killed Amon, he took his armor, so that iconic horned armor that we know Ahriman for was actually originally Amon's. Given that Magnus was profoundly changed and we haven't caught up with him much since then, and the fact that he and Amon had very much drifted apart, it's not known how he felt about the death of his old tutor and father figure, but I can't imagine it was a very intense reaction, given how accustomed to tragedy and loss Magnus had become by that time. But what do you guys think? Do you guys believe that these parents were good or maybe better than the ones in the previous video? Or do you think that they were, all in all, a lot worse? As always, I would love to hear what you guys have to say in the comments below, because I do read every single one. Please subscribe if you have not already done so, consider supporting me on Patreon or joining my Discord server down below, and until then, I will see you in the next video.